I co-signed her apartment, handed her my credit card, and believed every word she said about her past, and she used all of it to run a scam on me that lasted almost 2 years. By the time I figured out who she really was, my credit was wrecked. My name was on a lease she refused to leave, and I was sleeping on a coworker's couch wondering how I let it get that far. I found out she had lied about her past the same week she maxed out my credit card. Not a small charge, not an accident. $4,100 across 4 days, and when I called her about it, she told me it was my fault for not being clearer about what she was and wasn't allowed to spend. That was Danielle. That was always Danielle. She had this way of flipping things so fast your head would spin. One minute she was crying and telling you how much she loved you. The next she was cold and clipped and acting like you had personally wronged her by simply existing and asking a question. I spent almost 2 years trying to figure out which version of her was real. I'm not sure either one was. I want to tell this from the beginning because I think the beginning matters. I think it explains how a reasonably smart, reasonably self-aware person ends up completely hollowed out by someone they thought they were building a life with. I met Danielle at a mutual friend's birthday thing. Outdoor bar, midsummer, that sticky kind of heat where everyone is sweating through their clothes but pretending they're not. She was standing near the end of the bar with a drink she wasn't really touching, and she had this way of watching a room without looking like she was watching it. I noticed her immediately. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We talked for maybe 40 minutes that first night. She was funny, sharp. She asked questions that felt genuinely curious, not just conversational filler. She told me she'd moved to the city about 8 months earlier, that she'd left a bad situation back home and was starting over. She said it simply, without drama, like it was a fact she'd made peace with. I respected that, or I thought I did. Looking back, I think I just accepted it without actually understanding what she meant. Starting over from what? Bad situation in what sense? I filled in the blanks with something sympathetic and moved on. We exchanged numbers. She texted first, which surprised me. We got coffee that week, dinner the week after that. By the third date, I was completely gone on her. She was the kind of person who made you feel like the most interesting man in the room. Not in a fake, performative way, at least not at the start. She remembered small things I'd mentioned. She'd bring them up weeks later, casually, and it made me feel seen. Like she was actually paying attention to me in a way I hadn't experienced in a while. I was 31. I'd been out of a long relationship for about a year and a half. I wasn't desperate, but I was ready. And Danielle showed up feeling exactly like what I'd been missing. We made it official about 6 weeks in. She introduced me to her friends. I introduced her to mine. Everything moved at that comfortable pace where nothing feels rushed, but you can feel it building into something real. The first thing that should have stopped me cold came about 3 months in. She mentioned casually, while we were cooking dinner at her place, that her last relationship had ended because her ex had been controlling. That he'd tracked her phone, gone through her messages, made her feel like a prisoner. She said this while chopping vegetables, her back to me, like she was reading it off a grocery list. I told her I was sorry. I told her no one deserved that. She turned around and looked at me, and her eyes were wet. She said, "I just need someone who trusts me, who gives me space to be myself. That's all I've ever wanted." I told her that was who I was trying to be. She smiled and turned back to the vegetables. I thought about that conversation a lot later, because I think it was a setup. I think she was telling me exactly what she needed me to hear so that later, when I started asking questions, she'd have a ready-made reason to call me controlling too. She was laying the groundwork. I didn't see it. I saw a woman with a painful past who needed to be treated right. About 5 months in, she brought up moving in together. It wasn't something I'd been thinking about yet, honestly. My apartment was fine. Her lease was ending, she said. She'd been looking around, but the market was brutal. She didn't push exactly, but she brought it up in a way that made it feel natural, obvious even. Like, of course, we'd want to be together. Why wouldn't we? I should tell you where I was financially at that point. I had decent credit, a stable job in project management at a mid-sized logistics firm. I wasn't rich, but I was solid. I saved consistently. I didn't have debt. My credit score was good enough that I got the best rate when I financed my car. Danielle's credit, she explained carefully, wasn't in great shape. Her ex, she said, had taken out accounts in her name without her knowing. She'd been dealing with the fallout. She was disputing things, she said. It was a process. In the meantime, she couldn't get approved for an apartment on her own. She asked if I would co-sign. I want to be honest here. A part of me hesitated. Not a big part, not a loud part. Just a quiet flicker of something that said this is a lot to take on right now. But she was looking at me with this complete openness, this vulnerability, and I thought about what she'd told me about her ex, about needing someone who trusted her, about wanting to feel safe. I co-signed the lease. It was a two-bedroom in a decent part of town. Nice building, good natural light, rooftop access. We moved in at the end of month 6 of our relationship. Her stuff was everywhere within 48 hours. My stuff took another week to fully migrate over. For a while, it was genuinely good. We had a routine. We cooked together a few nights a week. We had friends over. She got a job at a boutique event planning company, which she loved, and she talked about it with this real energy that I found infectious. I was happy. I remember being actually happy. The lease was in both our names, but rent came from my account. She contributed at first. Not 50-50 because she made less than me and I wasn't going to be rigid about that. But she chipped in. Regularly, reliably. For the first 3 months or so. Then it got inconsistent. She'd have a slow month, she said. A client payment got delayed. She needed to cover a car thing. I absorbed it. We'd talk about it and she'd be apologetic and warm and she'd press her face against my shoulder and say she hated feeling like she wasn't pulling her weight and that she was going to fix it. And then a week later it was like the conversation had never happened. I kept a mental note, but I didn't keep a written one. That was my mistake. I should have tracked it. Instead, I told myself it was a rough patch and couples have rough patches and the good parts were still really good, so I held on. The cycling was so subtle at first that I couldn't name it. I just knew that every time I felt like things were getting tense between us, something shifted and she'd be the Danielle I'd fallen for. Affectionate, funny, thoughtful. She'd planned something sweet, a day trip, a nice dinner she actually cooked from scratch, something that reminded me of the early months. And I'd exhale, and I'd tell myself I'd been overthinking it. Then something small would happen. I'd mention the rent thing again. Or I'd ask where she'd been when she said she'd be home by 7 and it was 9. And she'd go cold. Not dramatic cold, just this quiet withdrawal that made the air in the apartment feel different. Like I'd done something wrong just by asking. I didn't realize until much later that that's called cycling. Hot and cold. Reward and punishment, it's a thing. It has a name. People write about it. But when you're inside it, you just think you're in a complicated relationship and you're trying to be patient. The lies about her past started unraveling about 14 months in. I ran into a woman named Carla at a work event. Carla had gone to school with Danielle. They'd been close, she said, for about 3 years, until something happened. I asked what happened, the way you do when someone drops that kind of sentence and clearly wants to keep going. Carla told me that Danielle had borrowed a significant amount of money from her. Not a loan with any paperwork, just a between friends thing because Danielle had said she was in a desperate spot. Carla had never gotten it back. When she'd pushed on it, Danielle had ghosted her and then, somehow, made it seem within their mutual friend group like Carla was the one who'd done something wrong. Carla said she'd been ostracized for a year because of it. She'd eventually just moved on. I didn't go home that night and confront Danielle. I know that sounds strange, but I was already learning that confronting Danielle about anything required a certain kind of preparation, because if I went in unprepared, she'd flip it, and I'd end up apologizing before I even got to my point. So I sat with it for a few days. I talked to Marcus, a coworker of mine who I'd slowly gotten closer to over those months. Marcus was the kind of guy who didn't say much, but when he said something, it was usually exactly right. He'd watch me go through the worst of this without me fully explaining the details, just picking up on the fact that I was stressed and not quite okay. I told him what Carla had said. Marcus didn't react dramatically. He just said quietly, "Do you believe her?" I said I did. He said, "Then you need to figure out what else you don't know." That was it. That was his contribution, but it was enough to make me start looking. I'm not proud of the next part, because it involved going through things I wouldn't normally go through. Danielle had mentioned her ex more than once, the controlling one who tracked her phone, and I didn't want to be that guy. But I also had my name on a lease for another 10 months, and I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I found old messages on her laptop. She'd left it open, logged into an old email account I hadn't known existed. I wasn't looking for it. I was going to print something. But I saw a thread, and I read it, and I wished for a long time after that I hadn't. The thread was between her and someone she'd been with before her supposed controlling ex, a man she'd moved in with. His name was Peter, and the emails were from about 3 years before I met her. From what I could piece together, she had done almost exactly the same thing to him. She'd gotten him to co-sign something, had borrowed money with vague promises of paying it back, and when he'd started to push back, she'd managed to turn their mutual friends against him. One of his emails, which she'd never responded to, just said, "I can't believe you told everyone those things. None of it was true, and you know it." I sat in front of that laptop for a long time. I didn't feel angry, not at first. I felt something more like cold. Like when you finally understand the rules of a game you've been losing, and you realize you were never supposed to win. I closed the laptop. I went to work the next day. I told Marcus in a parking garage at 7:45 in the morning, and he